The Reid machine, like if you had to kind of sum it up for folks, a certain kind of expected turnout of vote that mostly Democratic populations can get. Maybe where it stands today, you mentioned obviously Senator Reid passed away 3 years ago.
Nevada, if they're not from there and they're politically paying attention to these races, they know that there's a large Latino electorate, and that's true. There's about 20% of the electorate is Latino, and that is a very sizable number.
You're talking about ground game, and going back to Latino for a minute, Libre Initiative has been out there for years. I'm talking, to conservatives, not really with party ID, but out in those areas, knocking on doors, building coalitions, economic opportunity, some of that. And they see that as a game changer in those small margins.
So you talked about the top of the ticket. You alluded to that earlier. I took some of your feedback to be some, I don't want to say critique, but some acknowledgement that Harris has not maybe caught the way that some Democrats would like her to catch in the state. How much of that is Trump's strength? How much of that is changing demographics? How much of it is maybe some baggage from Joe Biden?
If you had to be concerned about anything in her campaign, what would it be?
The top of the ticket and how that might affect down ballot.
Welcome to the latest episode of Crosstalk Politics. I am Joel Payne, and I am joined by Leslie Sanchez, my co-host. And Leslie and I are gonna be having a great conversation today about the Silver State, the great state of Nevada, which a lot of the viewers know is near and dear to my heart. I'm somebody who worked for the former Senate Majority Leader, the late Senator Harry Reid, for a number of years. And so I know the state somewhat well, but I don't know it quite as well as our guest today who's going to be joining us. And Leslie, we're going to be joined by Chris Moyer. Chris is the founder and CEO of Moyer Strategies. Chris is also a former traveling press secretary for Majority Leader Harry Reid. So he traveled the state both while he was on the official side and also on the campaign side for the Majority Leader, and now does work in the state on labor, public health, and gaming issues. And so knows Nevada really well and is going to give us some really good insights here. So Leslie, feel free to add anything before we jump in.
Hey, I love Nevada. Let me tell you, there's a Naval Air Station Fallon. I guess it's up there. So Top Gun, that is a training ground for Top Gun. So just woohoo. Hey, a little shout out to naval aviation, but I think it's going to be, that's not something we usually talk about when we talk about the political dynamics of the state, but it's such a diverse state. And it's so exciting to have somebody who's really on the ground that can explain and unpack all of this for us, because it's changed so much just even since the time that George W. Bush won Nevada years ago. And I'm really excited to see where we are today.
Yeah, that's for sure. So Chris, thanks for indulging us and welcome. I want to say hello to the viewers there.
Yes, Joel, Leslie, thank you so much for having me. Always love the chance to talk about Nevada. It's one of the most interesting states in the country, both politically and otherwise, and excited to dive in here.
Well, so Chris, let's start here. Orient the viewers and the listeners to the state as it sits right now, not just a few weeks before the election, but in 2024. This is a state that has changed a lot demographically, politically of late. To someone who does not spend as much time thinking about the state as you do, what are some kind of top level points you would use to orient them to the state?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, when they think about Nevada, if they're not from there and they're politically paying attention to these races, they know that there's a large Latino electorate, and that's true. There's about 20% of the electorate is Latino, and that is a very sizable number. But just let me break down the state for you for a second. You have Las Vegas in Clark County, which encompasses Las Vegas, where there's about 90% of the electorate in the population. And for someone to win, well, from a Democratic point of view, if you're going to win the state, you really have to drive up turnout in Las Vegas and win by a large margin. The next area I'll point your attention to is Reno, which is Washoe County, and that typically has been a Republican county, but over the last couple decades, that has shifted and become a place where Democrats can win, not nearly by the margin that Democrats win in Clark County, but It's long been one of the bellwether counties in the whole country. And then you have everywhere else, which is the rural counties. And Republicans want to drive up turnout there. It's very red, these places. And Democrats want to keep those margins down. They're never going to win those counties outright, but if they can try to keep the margins down, then they have a pretty good shot combined with the other two pieces of winning the state.
That's really helpful. Leslie, how does that kind of square with your understanding of the state?
I'm glad you started with Latino. I mean, Latino's the big conversation right now, not only because voter registration going up, Republicans are saying that they're going to be competitive. They are concerned, obviously, about the dynamic change there and see that as an opportunity. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the culinary unions. That's a union. When people think about unions, they kind of have maybe harken back to another day, but this isn't particularly old union in terms of membership, and the priorities that they have are a little bit different considering the state they're from.
Well, it's interesting because Nevada is a right to work state, but then at the same time, you have the culinary union, among others, but certainly culinary is the most heralded because they have a lot of power and influence in the state, and they make up the hotel workers, the cleaning staff at the casinos, servers, cocktail waitresses, and others. And one of the things that I remember from working on Senator Reid's campaign in 2010 is that they bring you into this union hall with the culinary workers, maybe about 300 of them, sitting in a long, like football field size room. And they get in there and they fire them up and they're stomping and they're chanting and they put the candidate at the front of the room. And believe me, you remember that when they come back to ask you for things, because that's the most energy in the whole campaign trail, the whole cycle is that room. And so they know what they're doing. And they know how to get voters out to the polls as well. They've done this for several cycles in a row. If we want to talk about the change and how Nevada became a state that narrowly wins for Democrats and has become tougher terrain for Republicans, it's because of Senator Reid and his operation that he put in place going back to the 2008 presidential caucuses that really was the beginning of the Reid machine. And it's continued even 3 years now almost since the senator's passing. We saw in 2022 that same machine delivered, and the culinary union is a huge, huge part of that.
Yeah, Chris, you actually read my mind because that's actually where I was going to go next. Just diving deep a little bit on this Reid machine, which it's vaunted as something that people hear about in national politics, but I think you gave a good primer for it. You know, the Reid machine, like if you had to kind of sum it up for folks, it's really, when they say like the Reid machine, they're really just talking about a certain kind of expected turnout of vote that mostly Democratic populations can get to drive for the state ballot issues, for state office, and for national office. Could you dive a little bit deeper on like what that machine is and maybe where it stands today? You mentioned obviously Senator Reid passed away 3 years ago. Does that machine still endure past his now that he is no longer with us?
Well, I remember getting calls from reporters 2 years ago at this time with that very question. And people were very excited, not excited, but eager to write the story of the death of the Reid machine. And then it didn't quite work out that way. And so they had to put those stories off for maybe at least a couple more years. But it really, the people involved in carrying out in the strategy that Senator Reid set from the very beginning, almost 20 years ago, are still in place. That includes Rebecca Lamb, who is very well known at this point for her role. And it's also the culinary union, as we mentioned. But what they really do well is, like you're saying, Joel, is they turn out reliable voters. And in these close races, I can get into that in just a second, how close these races have been. But that turnout is what matters. When you think about canvassing in a ground game in a place like Nevada, especially Las Vegas, where it's 100 degrees for months on end, and even when you get to this time of year, it's still, I was in Las Vegas last week, it was still 100 degrees, and people don't really want to go out and knock on doors, and it's exhausting work. But with the culinary union, that ground game has been so reliable, and there's no reason to think that it's not going to come through, at least for their part, this time as well. And just looking at that can make the whole difference in these races. You look at Senator Catherine Cortez Masto 2 years ago. She won by 7,928 votes. That's 0.7%. In 2016, when she first was running for Senate, she won by a relative landslide by 27,000 votes, or about 2.5%. And so, you look at Senator Jackie Rosen as well. Like, she, in 2018, when she first ran, she won by 5% in what was a very good year for Democrats, since it was the first year after Donald Trump being in the White House. So the Reid machine, it really largely is the ground game, but it's also the ability to attract the resources to the state that help with getting the message out across all channels.
Leslie, back over to you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, like, when you talk about dollars, it's certainly been a very important fundraising area. I used to go with the former RNC chairman. We made many stops in Las Vegas along Casino Row to a lot of big names that are still part of the legacy and the part of the Republican Party in terms of fundraising. And I'm thinking, you're talking about ground game, and going back to Latino for a minute, Libre Initiative has been out there for years. I'm talking, to conservatives, not really with party ID, but out in those areas, knocking on doors, building coalitions, economic opportunity, some of that. And they see that as a game changer in those small margins. And looking at that, and you mentioned some of the names, I wanted to say, where do you think the Senate race is going to go? It's been really competitive Senate landscape this year.
Yeah, so they just had their first and only televised debate last night. That's Senator Jackie Rosen, who, as I mentioned, was first elected in 2018. She was in a very competitive House seat just 2 years prior to that, was never in elected politics beforehand, but has deep roots in the community. She was the president of her synagogue. She's been in Nevada for over 30 years. And she's running against a veteran named Sam Brown, who is a okay candidate. He ran last time 2 years ago and lost in the primary. But all the public polling has shown that Senator Rosen is winning outside the margin of error. There's some polls even showing double digits, but I don't really buy that. And she's raised about 3 times as much money as Sam Brown. It's a lean Democratic race, according to the Cook Political Report. And a few things that help her succeed, because you could ask the question, well, why is she doing seemingly better than Senator Cortez Masto did last cycle? Well, one is she actually does do very well with Latinos. 2, she's very likable in general. She's very hard to demonize. As if you've ever met her, or if you've seen her, she just is not. She's not some demon. It's very hard to paint a portrait of her of that. She comes across like a mom, and she has a lot of things that she can claim for the state, like billions of dollars. Well, it's going to be billions, but significant money from the Inflation Reduction Act, for example, for clean energy projects that are really important for Nevada. And she's a effective enough communicator where and she knows she has a great team and knows what folks around the state are really focused on. She has a lot of support from Republican mayors in some of these rural counties that I was mentioning, and has built a broad, diverse coalition that looks like at this point will help her get across the finish line for re-election.
If you had to be concerned about anything in her campaign, what would it be?
The top of the ticket, and how that might affect down ballot. And the fact that it's just Nevada, like I mentioned, Nevada, Joel, this is for you, but they're kind of like Nevada Democrats have won, but it's been close. It's like having a heart attack closer, and Edwin Diaz, you might say. You might end up winning, but it's going to be stressful in the process.
Chris is he's speaking to my heart. I'm a Mets fan, and the Mets right now are on the brink of elimination. So he's talking to me in October, which I appreciate. Well, Chris, you alluded to I kind of noticed you hesitated when you said Sam Brown is a quote okay candidate. I think I know what you meant there. I actually think that what belies that a little bit is the recent history of candidate quality on the Republican side. Now, it seems like they found a candidate that obviously a lot of Nevadans responded to, in Joe Lombardo, who is the governor, who won last cycle. But if you look at Adam Laxalt, you look at Sam Brown now. Obviously, if you go back to our time with Senator Reid, Sue Loudon, and eventually Sharon Engel, Republicans have really struggled at times to find kind of candidate quality. Sam Brown is not kind of far. He is at least not positioned as like far right MAGA in the national dialogue. Can you talk a little bit about, and Leslie, you should jump in here too, but maybe
Yeah.
Chris first. Chris, what is the local perspective on Sam Brown? And then Leslie, you should feel free to add color to that.
Well, I mean, it's just bizarre that he gets credit for acknowledging that Joe Biden actually won the last election, but that's kind of where we are in the Republican Party these days.
That hurt, Chris. That hurt. Yeah, go.
But yeah, I mean, he has a interesting story. There's a lot of, as far as a profile on paper. Again, as a veteran, it's visible. He has damage and scars on his face that are from an explosion when he was serving, and so there's a lot to respect about him. He struggled with one. He's only been in Nevada for a relatively short amount of time. That plays a little bit less in Nevada because it's a very transient place and a lot of people are new to the state, but he did run for office previously in Texas. He struggled a little bit on some of his past positions, maybe when he was running in Texas, when it comes to issues like abortion. And as much as he's tried to talk his way out of that, the past comments are what they are. And so, it's probably, he's not one of the worst candidates in the last 15 years in Nevada. Certainly Sharon Engel takes the cake for that one. But he's still not looking, at least as far as all the polling that I've seen and heard about, he's not in a position at this point to win the race.
Leslie, feel free to add color there. I know we're
So
talking Republicans.
I'll add some support to this idea. Very well funded, military veteran, exciting in terms of that. The kind of a more traditional Republican background that establishment Republicans would really favor in many cases. We've seen so many of the MAGA type you talked about don't get a lot of traction. He's kind of a blend of the both, and talking about those reforms, and has been really well supported, I would say, outside of Nevada. People were excited about him. And what he could bring to Washington. So there's still a lot of excitement. What's interesting and that we see in the numbers a lot, and you alluded to, is there is that top of the ticket. Trump so far is just on the margin there, but looks like he could win. And he's gaining momentum, let's say that, in Nevada at this time, and is closing strong. Anything can happen in that short window, but that's what the trend line is right now. But these Senate candidates, Arizona too, right, are about 5-6, the Republicans about 5-6 points below where the former president is. And it's frustrating on their part. They're wondering about split ticket. They're wondering about, things we didn't used to talk about. How do you see that lining up yourself, Chris?
Well, I think it's interesting. One, Sam Brown, to your point, Leslie, was one of the few candidates who I think had both Trump and Mitch McConnell supporting from the get-go, which is famously not usually how that goes. It is interesting too when we think about there's no more split tickets with Senate races and presidential races. At least that's the thinking, where that seems to be something that is perhaps dooming John Tester in Montana, where it's just too much of a hill for him to climb. But then you have the possibility here of two different outcomes or split tickets in both Arizona and Nevada with the presidential and the Senate. Obviously, that's not assured. We'll see what happens with the election, but there's a possibility of it just based on polling, and that is something that we didn't think was supposed to happen anymore.
Yeah, it's one thing to outrun the top of the ticket by 5 points. It's another thing what John Tester's going to have to do. He's going to outrun the top of the ticket by 20 points, right? Like, so I know this is we're talking Nevada here, but that's just an example to the point about the ticket splitting. It is so challenging, I think, in this polarized political environment where people really are less likely to kind of splice their ticket choices like that. Chris, and I know we're kind of coming up here on maybe the end of our time, maybe try to build on your last answer, and that Leslie was getting at. So you talked about the top of the ticket. You alluded to that earlier. I took some of your feedback to be some, I don't want to say critique, but some acknowledgement that Harris has not maybe caught the way that some Democrats would like her to catch in the state. How much of that is Trump's strength? How much of that is changing demographics? How much of it is maybe some baggage from Joe Biden? Obviously being the president for the last 3+ years and, rising costs and things like that in the state that we know tend to hurt Democrats.
Well, I think like in Nevada and across the like across the country, there seems to be a divide that is not as much as it used to be along racial and ethnicity lines, but across gender and education. And Nevada is one of the most diverse electorates in the country, and but it's also probably one of the lower educated in the country, and that plays to Trump's favor. I just seeing some of the billboards that Trump had up around Las Vegas last week. If they could just separate, if they could get the candidate to match what they're doing with their paid media, this would be a much different race because some of the advertising they're doing is very smart. On the pro-Harris side, they're running ads. I saw one ad in Tagalog to try to reach a large Filipino community in Las Vegas that doesn't always get the same attention, certainly as the Latino electorate. But the question, like we're seeing in a lot of reporting in the last couple of weeks, is about young men, and particularly young men of color. And in Nevada, that's young Latinos. And the thing that has really come through that I've observed is a real conflict that these voters feel with the rhetoric and they know Trump's a racist, but they also think he's a racist who might be able to help them economically. And whether that's accurate or not, that's how they kind of view the choice right now. And they don't know enough about Kamala Harris, and which is why I think it's very important for her to be doing these interviews, to be going into more challenging terrain like she did with Fox News this week, and using these last couple of weeks here to continue to help people get to know who she is, and also remind them that maybe things weren't quite the way voters might remember during the Trump years.
Leslie, you want to close us out with a final?
I'll close us out on that. Well, Nevada is very near and dear to my heart. It's grown so much and changed so much from when I first started working there, in the 1990s to, and I remember former Governor Brian Sandoval, and kind of was such a historic being a Latino governor at the time, just very forward in what they do. And then in most recent time, being able to spend time in in those rural areas near Reno and northern Nevada, where the military and naval air stations are so strong, and a lot of military families retiring there and serving there. And it just changes your perspective on what is going on. And I think the economy is that undercurrent, beyond calling people names and different things. These families I speak with, regardless of that spectrum, are looking out for, how are they going to make ends meet in a difficult time. So that's where we're going to end up seeing, what comes to the top of the ticket. And I do have a funny story. I did adopt an alpaca. And sawdust alpacas, throw them a shout out, something you wouldn't expect I did. But my husband and I adopted an alpaca in anticipation of a deployment. So it was very funny, and the alpaca did amazing, and his name was Shogun. So I will.
Shogun the alpaca.
Shogun the alpaca did really well. We honor you. And the big question we want to ask you, Chris, election night. What are you going to be watching? How are you going to get a sense of what's coming in based on voter turnout that day?
Well, I think the first thing to remind everybody is just to be patient with Nevada. I love Nevada, but they're not the quickest to count the ballots. And so we remember from 4 years ago, it took a few days. We remember from 2 years ago for the Senate race, it took a few days. And so one is just to be patient. But I'm curious to see the margin in Washoe County, to see what that's looking like. As I mentioned earlier, it's a place that has typically been more conservative, but has become a little bit more reliable for Democrats in recent years. And if things are going well in in Washoe, then that's probably a good sign. But you know, and of course the Latino vote, and we'll see what the exit polls are saying there. But is it going to be in line with 2 years ago? Is it going to be in line with 4 years ago? If it drops below those levels, then that could be a real problem.
Well, Chris, you gave us so much to chew on here, and I know how much the viewers and listeners are going to learn from this conversation. We're so grateful for your time. Again, Chris Moyer, founder and CEO of Moyer Strategies, longtime Nevada political consultant, joining Leslie Sanchez and myself, Joel Payne, for another episode of Crosstalk Politics. Until next time, we'll talk to you, and can't wait for the next conversation.
Can't wait. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you both. It's great to talk with you.